evidence, and argument analysis and evaluation. So I will start first with evidence, and then the next topic will be argument analysis and evaluation. This lecture is on evidence as the foundation of the argument. So let us recall first what we have discussed about the argument, about the nature of the argument. There are two basic parts of the argument. First is the conclusion, and the conclusion is the claim of the argument. Okay, the claim, the thesis, actually, the thesis or the position of the argument. We can also call the conclusion as a hypothesis. Okay, hypothesis or a temporary conclusion. So you can have the final conclusion at the end, and you can also have a temporary conclusion, the hypothesis, which you normally state at the beginning of the argument. So for example, in an experiment, you state your hypothesis first. This would be your preliminary conclusion. And then at the end, you're going to have your final conclusion. Okay? Now, if the argument is very long, you can also have what we call intermediate conclusion, meaning it is not yet the final conclusion. If you have presented several proofs or evidence, then you can have a conclusion, but that conclusion is not yet the final conclusion because you can still add some more proof to it, and then based on the additional proof or evidence, you can have another conclusion until you have arrived at the final conclusion. Okay, so the conclusion is not always just one statement. Okay, the conclusion can be stated at the beginning as a kind of hypothesis. Then at the middle of your argument or your thesis, you can have an intermediate conclusion until you reach the final conclusion. And then, of course, the premises. Okay, so the premises is that part of the argument which contain the evidences or the proofs that we use to support the claim or the conclusion. So you can state the hypothesis at the beginning, your initial conclusion, and then come up with premises or proofs, evidences, until you have validated your hypothesis. So once your hypothesis is validated, proven, then you're going to have now the final conclusion. Okay? So the premises gives the premises, they give us the reasons or the basis of the argument. So it can be in the form of a statement, it can be data, it can be information, it could be facts that we use to support our argument. So what is the nature of an evidence or a proof? Okay, because while we can give certain statements to support our claim, our statement must also be supported with evidence. So the question is, what is an evidence? So an evidence is the proof that supports our claim. It is the foundation or basis of our argument. Okay? So it's where our claim, our conclusion, our hypothesis rests, the basis. So needless to say that your argument will only be as good as its foundation, or it will only be as good as the evidence that you present. So you can make certain claims, you can make certain allegations, but without the evidence, it's nothing. So like, for example, you can claim that the election was rigged, that the election involved fraud, it was fraudulent. But if you don't present any proof, any evidence, your argument will just be thrown out of the window. So, an evidence can be concrete facts or an observable behavior. We're going to distinguish these later on. Okay. An evidence can also be whatever is accepted by the audience and can be used to support claims or conclusion. So facts can be observed. So it becomes an evidence. behavior of people can also be used as an evidence. So you can say, he's quite uncomfortable. Why? Well, you look at how he reacts. He's perspiring, for example. So perspiration could be an evidence that somebody may be lying, for example, or he may feel uncomfortable. Or you can say, that person is hiding something. Why? Well, because of his behavior. Now, it's not just the facts or the behavior. Whatever is accepted by the audience can be used as an evidence. What are these accepted by the audience? And by audience here, we mean those individuals or groups that are actually involved in a particular discussion. So, for example, if I am a scientist and I make a certain claim, okay, and I cite a particular provision or I cite particular information, if that particular provision or information is accepted by the audience at large, then that can be used as an evidence. We will qualify this idea about accepted by the audience later on. So, given that, what can be used as an evidence? Number one, as already mentioned, these are facts, okay, or the facts or conditions which are objectively observable. By objectively observable, we mean those that can be perceived directly. First-hand perception, first-hand. Okay, so for example, um, everybody can see that the sun is shining. You go out, the sun is shining. Everybody can see that. So it's a condition that is not based on simply opinions of people, because everybody can observe that. It's an objectively observable thing. Next, the beliefs or premises that are generally accepted as true by the audience. So it may not be factual, okay, but if there is a particular belief that is accepted by people, generally by people, by the audience, then that can be used as an evidence. For example, nobody among us have lived during the Spanish era, during the Spanish era. But there were certain beliefs about the Spanish period that have been passed on to us for generation. So although these are conditions or facts that we did not observe, but this is a belief accepted by the audience, then it can be used as an evidence. Okay? Of course, these beliefs are also supported by facts, but only that we don't have or we don't directly observe the facts that support that particular belief. So, gel accepted as true by the audience. Who are the audience? The audience are normally the individuals who are involved or who belong to a particular discipline. For example, if I am a scientist, who will be my audience in my experiments? Well, my fellow scientists. That would be my audience. If I am a lawyer, I'm speaking about a particular case, who will be my audience? Well, my fellow lawyers. And if my fellow lawyers, for example, accept that particular belief, that could be accepted as an evidence. Now, what do you mean by accepting as true? By accepting as true, it means that it is below the level of dispute. What do you mean by below the level of dispute? Nobody is contesting that. So if I say, for example, the earth is round and nobody objects, everybody accepts that the earth is round. My fellow scientists accept that. If everybody accepts that, then that means it is below the level of dispute. Nobody is questioning. So that can be used as an evidence. It must follow, therefore, these conditions. It must not disagree with observable conditions. Also, if I make a belief that, for example, well, the earth is round, it does not disagree with observable conditions. The earth is really round, even if I cannot present facts about it. Next, that it must be below the level of dispute. Nobody is questioning. Now, suppose somebody questions a particular belief, then that belief cannot be used as an evidence. It becomes a claim. Okay? And as a claim, it must be supported by evidence. So a belief that is put into question cannot be used as an evidence because it becomes a claim. It becomes a hypothesis that must be proven. But if nobody disputes a particular belief, then it is accepted, and therefore it can be accepted. It can be used as an evidence. Now, another thing that can be used as evidence would be conclusions previously established. Meaning, these are claims which have been previously supported by evidence. Before, it was just a claim, but now it has been established. So, that becomes a final conclusion. Then it can become part of the evidence. It can be used as an evidence. Examples of this would be the final rulings of courts. The final rulings of courts. For example, the final ruling of the Supreme Court. So, the final rulings of the Supreme Court can be used as an evidence. What about the rulings of the lower courts? Not yet. Why? Because it's not yet ruled with finality. Meaning, the decisions of the lower courts can still be appealed or it can still be changed by the higher court. But once it reached the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court already ruled with finality, final ruling of the Supreme Court, then that means it can now be used as an evidence. But if it's a ruling that can still be overturned, it can be changed, then it cannot be used yet as an evidence. So, what are the types of evidence? The first type of evidence would be facts. Okay? We call this factual evidence. So what are facts? These are things people believe to be the case. What do you mean by believe to be the case? Well, people observe it. Okay? It can be experienced directly, firsthand. Okay? So it's a fact that, for example, that the sun is shining. Or it's a fact that it's raining. So everybody can experience it. Or it's a fact that fire can burn. Okay? So these are facts. And of course, there are many different types of facts. But generally, when you say facts, these are experienced directly. And it can be verified through observation or experiments. It can be seen. It can be heard. It can be felt. It can be tasted. Some can even be measured. Okay? So, for example, if you say that water boils at 100 degrees centigrade, then you can do experiments. And you can measure. You can determine the temperature. Once it reaches 100 degrees centigrade, water will start to boil or simmer. Okay? So, those are the facts. Now, it can also be the truthfully reported experiences of others. Like, for example, narrative accounts of some objective occurrence. Narrative accounts. So, for example, say, your Lola or Lolo tells you about her or their experiences during the Japanese period or the American period. Okay? Or, for example, somebody can tell you what happened, for example, in the other parts of the globe. So, that can be used as an evidence. But the important thing here is that this is a truthfully reported experience. So it cannot just be some speculations, or somebody can just be imagining something. I have seen some unidentified flying objects. That cannot be used as an evidence because it actually becomes a claim. that needs to be supported by proof. Okay? Next, could be facts and figures that have been systematically collected and organized to convey information. One example of this would be, for example, financial reports. So the financial report of a particular company, it will, you can see there the figures of the income of the company. So it can be used as an evidence. Okay? Because they involve figures that have been collected systematically, organized, etc., etc. Okay? Financial reports, the president reports, okay? For example, some audit reports, and so on and so forth. So these are evidence, factual evidence. And of course, lastly, you have the physical evidence that will help to prove a particular claim. Like, for example, say the weapon used in a crime or some artifacts. So if you are in archaeology or anthropology or whatever, then you discovered this particular bone, okay, or fossil, for example, that's a physical evidence. So archaeologists or scientists are looking for physical evidence, okay, to prove a particular claim. Astrophysicists, for example, are looking for physical evidence in the universe about, about issues about the space, the outer space, or the universe. So this is the first type of evidence, factual evidence. The second type of evidence would be opinion as to fact or opinion evidence. So this is different from factual evidence because this is now someone's interpretation or analysis or assessment or evaluation on the meaning of factual evidence. The opinion of an expert about a particular evidence. So, it is a judgment or assessment about how a particular event or state of affairs or an object is to be understood, evaluated, or dealt with. You discovered a particular an object, for example, in your backyard. Strange looking object. But you don't know what it is. So what do? You ask somebody, maybe an archaeologist, or maybe what? And somebody who is an expert in that particular thing to analyze. If he's an expert in that area, in that discipline, his opinion can be used as an evidence. That's what we do, for example, when we, in the courts, when they ask somebody to testify about, for example, the medical record of somebody. So you have the medical record. It tells you some facts about a particular person, but you don't know how to interpret the medical record. So what do? Get a doctor, an expert in that particular field, and ask him about that particular piece of information. So his opinion, his judgment about this medical record constitute as opinion evidence. It is an opinion as to fact. So, for example, we consult, let us say, you found this bank account, but you don't know how to interpret the bank account. So you ask somebody from the bank, an expert, to provide his judgment, his opinion about a particular piece of information. So, opinions as to facts or opinion evidence are used by arguers who do not have the expertise on the topic of the argument. That's why you ask experts to interpret the facts. And the interpretation of expert on that particular topic can be used as an evidence. That's what we do. For example, when we cite people, you are writing about this and then you cite somebody who is an acknowledged expert in that particular field. So that's opinion evidence. Now, what are the qualities of a good evidence? Because as we've said, the quality of your claim, of your conclusion, of your hypothesis depends mainly on the quality of the evidence. It's the foundation. The evidence is the foundation of your argument. So, the evidence per se must be, one, relevant. We're going to discuss this one by one. Next, adequate. Next, consistent. Next, recent. So, we're going to discuss this one by one. Right? Now, as to the source of the information, because of course, you may have found this particular evidence or piece of information, but you also have to question, where did this information come from? Who is the source of this information? Okay? Because the source of the information affects the quality of the evidence. So, as to the source, it must be, one, reliable. Two, an expert. Three, objective. And consistent. So, the source of your information, where you get the information, must be reliable, must be an expert, must be objective, and must be consistent. All right, so let's discuss them one by one. The first is relevance. What do we mean by relevance? It means that the evidence, okay, could either be the facts or the opinion, should be directly related to the claims being made. Because you can provide all this information, all this, data, these facts, etc. But the question is it relevant to the issue? Is it relevant to the matter? If it is not relevant, it does not have any direct relation to the topic, to the subject matter, then no matter how the quantity, no matter how good the information is, but if it's not related to the evidence, to the claim, then it cannot be used as an evidence. It's not of good quality. So it must have a direct connection, no, to the claim. There must be a direct connection between the evidence, meaning the proof, okay, and your claim. That's very important. Must be relevant because, we have discussed in the fallacies, one of the fallacies is fallacy of relevance. We have cited so many, information. You have cited many books. You have presented physical evidence. But on closer look, it's not connected to what you're talking about. Okay? So you have to see that. Now, here's one example. Recently, a certain university conducted a study on the listening and note-taking skills of freshmen in their English courses. Okay. The study showed that students in these courses exhibited a lack of concentration and diligence in their studies. Okay, that's what the study showed. Lack of concentration and diligence in the studies. Hence, it can be concluded that college students are not interested in any English language or language-based subjects like math and science. First, we have to determine what is the claim here. The claim here is the conclusion that college students are not interested in any English language-based subjects like math and science. But what is the evidence used? A study that shows students exhibited lack of concentration and diligence in their studies. The question is, what is the connection between the lack of concentration and diligence and their not being interested in English language? Is there a connection between the two? Maybe there's a connection, but it's not a very good connection. So you can come up with a nice study, you can present information, but if those information, those evidences are not related to the subject, then it's an irrelevant evidence. Okay? I hope you get the point. Next, adequacy. It's not just a question of the information, the evidence being relevant. It must also be adequate. And what do you mean by adequacy? That the evidence, the information, the data, the facts, they are sufficient or strong enough to support your claim. Because yes, it may be directly related, it may be relevant. But if you have a very scant, very small information, it cannot stand, it cannot support your claim. So the information must be adequate enough. Like for example, you conduct a survey. There are, say, the population is about 1,000. You surveyed, say, 100 people. That's only 10%. And of the 100 that you've surveyed, only 50% of that 100 supported your claim. Well, it's not enough. It's inadequate. So arguer must exhaust all possible information or data relative to the issue or to the claim or to the subject matter. So exhaust all possible, gather as many information as possible. But of course, when you gather information, those information must be relevant to the subject. Okay. So for example, here, another example here. Recently, the University of St. John conducted a study on listening and study patterns of sophomore students in their speech and English classes. The study found that students in these classes exhibited poor memory in their studies and note-taking. They are poor in memory and note-taking. Therefore, they concluded that college students have poor study skills. That is a claim. Students have poor study skills. Is it enough to simply say that they exhibited poor memory in their studies and note-taking to support the claim that they have poor study skills? Maybe that is relevant. Maybe that is connected to the study skills, but it may not be sufficient. May not be adequate. Okay. Next, residency. Okay. Of course, recency or the standard of recency depends on the discipline. Because in some disciplines, a particular information, no matter how, for example, say it's been 25 years, but for some discipline, an information for the last 25 years may still be recent. But for a discipline where there is a fast, turnover of information, like for example, in computer, in technology, the data that you gathered 25 years ago may no longer be recent. So it depends on the discipline. So by recency, we mean the evidence should be sufficiently current on the topic of the argument. It must be up to date. This is the reason why when you write your proposal and you are supposed to submit your references, one of the things that is being checked is the date of the publication of your sources. Okay, the date. And you normally get the recent studies in journals because they are up to date. Journals are up to date. Of course, if you get a journal that's been published 50 years ago, depending on your discipline or area of discipline, the 25 may not be recent, but in some other disciplines, 25 may still be recent. So it depends really on the area or on the field. So it should be the latest information or data about the particular topic or issue. Well, that's why you go to the journals, because they provide you with the latest information, especially if a particular topic is being debated being discussed. So you want to know what is the latest in the discussion, in the scholarship of this particular topic. So you have to use recent information. Well, of course, it's not to say that you cannot use the old information, but you use that just to compare your information. Okay, you still want to use the most recent of the information about a particular topic or issue. And again, as I've said, the standard of recency of evidence varies from one discipline to another. So you have to know what is current in your discipline. For example, in the case of philosophy, well, 50 years ago, it could still be recent, could still be relevant. But in the field of information technology, for example, or in other sciences, 25 years ago is definitely not recent anymore. Next is consistency. Consistency means the absence of contradiction. Okay, that your information is not contradicting other information. Okay, so it's the absence of contradiction, whether from within or from without. So you have internal consistency, meaning the absence of self-contradiction within the information provided by a source. That the data do not disagree or contradict with one another. If you have, for example, you have, say, a financial report. It says this on one part, and then in the next part, it contradicts what is said in the previous parts. Then that means there is an internal inconsistency. Or, for example, a particular expert tells us his opinion about this thing. It tells one, and then contradicts himself in the next line. So there is an internal inconsistency. Okay, some officials will say there is fraud during the last election, and then later they will say we cannot find any evidence of fraud in the election. So obviously there is inconsistency. The other type of consistency is external consistency. It means that there must be an agreement of the evidence with other information and other sources of information. Okay? So internal consistency will be within, but it's not enough. Your information must also be consistent with other information. The facts that you present must also be consistent with other facts, or the physical evidence that you present must be consistent with other physical evidences that you use to support a particular conclusion or claim. Okay? So those are the qualities of your evidence. Now, let's go to the source of your information, of your evidence. One, reliability. So, what is reliability? It means that the source of the evidence or the information, okay, or the proof, or been proven to be correct many times in the past. Okay? So there is some kind of consistency here. Your source is reliable if he consistently provides you with correct information, with correct evidence. Because if in the past tells you this information is correct information, then the next information he gives you it's a fake information, he cannot be a reliable source of information. Okay? That is why in academic writing or in thesis writing, or when you do academic papers and you cite experts or sources, you establish their reliability. Because the quality of the information that they provide will also be affected by the integrity of your source. So if your source, is kind of he has a very inconsistent, no? The information that he provides is very inconsistent, then he cannot be a reliable source of information. So reliability of the source can be tested by looking into his past. Okay? So you check the backgrounds and records in the past if the source of that information evidence have proven to be a reliable source of information. But if he consistently changes, his opinions, for example, his assessment, for example, and he cannot be a reliable source of information. Okay? Now, take a look at this example. According to a source, in the latest survey released by the National Statistics Office, almost 25,000 people are involved in fatal alcohol-related car accidents per year. Of these 25 people, or 25,000 people, over 25% are under the age of 18. This means that we are losing over 6,000 young people per year because of alcohol. There is then the extreme need to enforce a drinking age all over the country, and this will save over 750 young lives per year nationwide. Now, don't just focus on the figures, okay? Focus first, if you are given this particular information and it tells you according to a source, the first question that you should ask is, who is the source? Okay, who is the source? That's one thing that you should ask always. As a critical thinker, well, you can think of the information provided, but you should also think, who is the source of this information? Of course, in journalism, in journalistic writing, normally we hide our source. We just say, well, according to a reliable source. Okay? But in the case of academic writing, you cannot just say according to a reliable source. You have to present who is the source of this information. Because that's how you establish the integrity, the reliability of your source. So that's very important in critical thinking and in research in academic writing. Second, expertise. Okay? So, what do you mean by expert? It means that the source of the information has a background, knowledge, and information relevant, okay, relevant to the subject matter under discussion. It's very important that the background, the knowledge, information of the source is relevant to the subject matter under discussion. Otherwise, you will fall or you will commit a fallacy that we have discussed last time as fallacy of argumentum ad pericondiam. You are citing an authority, meaning an expert, who may not be an expert in that particular subject matter or field. So again, it's very important to check on the background, on the knowledge, on the information relevant of the expert, relevant to the subject matter under discussion. So how do we do this? We check the education, formal training, the qualification, the experience of a source of information related to the topic. Okay? So you can say, well, he is a PhD. He has a PhD in mathematics. He must be an expert in mathematics. But if the subject matter under discussion is not on mathematics, let's say it's about politics, and he does not have formal training and experience on political matters, then he's not an expert in that field. And therefore, the source of information is questionable. That's why in the courts, in litigation, you always have to introduce who is your witness. Is he an expert in this field? Can we rely on his assessment based on his background, etc., etc.? Okay. So here, another example here. Mr. Reyes convincingly argued last month that pregnant women should restrict their intake of caffeine. According to studies he conducted over the last 5 years, he has found strong evidence to support the conclusion that caffeine is dangerous to unborn children. Okay, fine. But again, without mentioning the qualification of Mr. Reyes, his information can be questioned because he did not establish the expertise of Mr. Reyes. Who is this Mr. Reyes? What is his background? So it's always important to establish the expertise of your source. Okay? Now, next, objectivity. So your source of information must be reliable. He must be an expert. And he must also be objective. By objectivity, we mean that the source must be able to hold a fair and undistorted view on a question or an issue. So again, one thing that we need to avoid here is conflict of interest. Because if there is a conflict of interest, he cannot give a fair, objective assessment of something. Okay? Because, well, he may be, he has an interest in the issue. Okay? So again, we check his personal interest. We check the motives of the source, his political or ideological bias and prejudice. Because his interests, motives, and prejudice and biases will give us information about, well, whether he can give an objective, fair, and biased view or assessment about a particular thing. So, consider this example. In a special advertisement on its cosmetic products, Mr. Daniel Sanchez, Chief Executive of Triumph Cosmetics Corporation, said, "We have taken major steps over the past 2 years to improve our products and restructure of price schemes. With these steps, we guarantee customer satisfaction with regards to our products, and this will certainly establish Triumph in the cosmetics industry." Okay, fine. But when you look at the source of information, it's Mr. Sanchez, who is the chief executive of the company. So what do you expect Mr. Sanchez to tell us about his products? Well, he can give benefit of the doubt. He may be able to give an objective view, but his objectivity will always be questionable. Okay, because he has an interest in the company. Okay? That's why it's very important that we look for sources of information who can have objective, okay, fair, and biased opinion or assessment about a particular issue. Okay? Now, next, accuracy of citation. So you have a reliable source, you have an you have an objective source, you have an expert source, but it's also a question of the accuracy of citation. What do you mean by that? That what he says, assuming that he's getting this from a source, is an exact and faithful replication of the data or information given by or taken from a particular source. Because sometimes you have the information, but when you write it, okay, when you reproduce the information, sometimes the information may be slanted, or the way you replicate the information may not be accurate or exact anymore. So that tarnishes the quality of the information. Okay? So citations should be fully reported and not be misrepresented or intentionally distorted. Sometimes we quote passages from some books or even the Bible. We quote all this, we cite the Bible, we cite these books, but sometimes we cite them, the, we cite them to of course, we cite them to support our claim, but sometimes we splice them, we cut them in order to, you know, in order to support our claim. So the citation is no longer a faithful replication of the data or of the line that you have taken from a particular book or a particular source of information. Now, some would ask, suppose I omitted a particular part. Well, if you omitted a particular part in your direct quotation, you have to indicate that you have omitted some parts there. You cannot make it appear as if that's the exact quotation, when in fact, you have already spliced, you have already distorted the quotation. Okay, so it should not involve deliberate falsification. Sometimes people would quote a particular line in the Bible, and they will only quote those lines that favor their claim. Then the next line or next lines that do not favor them, they will just cut it. Okay, delete them. Okay, that's falsification. It's not an accurate citation, and we have to be very careful when we cite sources. Otherwise, uh, you will have to deal with number one, plagiarism. This falsification, and so on and so forth. So next would be access of your source. The source of an opinion must be in a position to observe directly the matter in question. Direct, okay? Not hearsay, okay? Not secondary information, okay? So hearsays or opinions of a third party may no longer be valid or acceptable because the information that they usually give are far from the truth or simply without basis. Hearsays. Okay? So if you have to quote a source, he must have a direct access on the information. Not according to this person who heard this from another person. Okay? I read in a book who mentioned another book which cites another book. It cannot be used in academic writing or in research. So let's have this. Let's try to evaluate this. A nationwide survey of college students conducted by an NGO 2 years ago revealed that 85% of those polled agreed that the government is not doing enough to control air pollution. In another study, it was shown that air pollution is largely caused by the presence of factories in urban areas. Some concerned sectors are then saying that there is a collusion between the government and owners of these big factories. Now, we will analyze this. So, the main argument is there is a collusion between government and owners of big factories. And the previous, these are all the information provided. Okay? So, what can you say about this argument? Anyone? Based on what we have discussed, how would you assess this argument based on the evidence that were presented? What can you say about this argument? Think of the criteria that we have discussed. How would you assess this argument? Will that be a good argument in the first place? Is the claim about collusion between government and factories rest on solid evidence, solid information?
Sir, maybe try lang.
Sige, yeah. Ano, open discussion tayo. Sige lang. Para masanay kayo na mag-critique. What is the evidence to support this particular claim? Would this information here support that claim? That's the point of critical thinking. You have to evaluate. Wait a minute. Is it enough? Are this data provided here
Sir,
relevant to the? Yeah.
Sir Ken, siguro sir, upon checking
Yeah.
this statement, it says here that the survey conducted by college students. I think yung pagiging expert po sir, hindi siya na follow through kasi college
Okay.
students yung naano,
Okay.
yung nag-survey.
Yeah, that's ang sinorvey.
Opo, sila po yung
Yeah.
nag-answer ng survey.
Nagsumagot.
So,
Yes.
yes. So, wala po dun sir yung pagiging expertise na it should be done by someone who is an expert talaga para
Yeah.
ma-prove na ayun, tama siya.
Okay. Okay, that's good. And then when you look at this, this is normally what they do. They will present us with figures. Like for example, 2 years ago, 85% of those polled. But when you look at this figure, 85% of those polled does not tell you how many answered the survey. 85% is a high percentage, but that will depend on the total respondents. See, let's say 20 people were asked, 20 college students were asked. 85% of that may be that's a big number, right? That's 17. Okay? But you only asked 20. Any other comments? Nowadays, you see a lot of information in the internet, social media, similar to this. And if we will just ignore them, this is how fake news is spread. You're not critical enough to question these things.
Sir, comment.
Yes, go ahead.
Um, the conclusion is about collusion between the government
Yes, collusion.
owners. So, but the results of the studies do not talk about something about collusion. Maybe there must have been like studies or results that mentions about halimbawa issuing an environmental certificate but failed to maybe comply.
Yeah.
Ganon. That might be a possible evidence of collusion. Pero in the studies, wala po eh. Yung presence of factories, that's normal. Pero meron po kasi mga criteria to pass, like yung certificates na issued by the government to make them legally operating.
Yeah. That's a good comment. That's a good observation because come to think of it, what's the connection between collusion and the presence of factories? Right? Does it follow right away that because there is a presence of urban areas, is already a collusion between government? Well, you can speculate, but you have to provide good information, evidence to establish this conclusion about collusion between government and big factories.
Sir?
Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, I think the access of the source,
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't able to cite the proper source.
Okay.
What NGO conducted
Yeah.
the survey, and
Yes. Okay.
about the
Yes.
85% is it's not actually accurate. The 85% of what, of how many, and there, and also
Yeah.
where did they got the percentage of
Yeah.
the poll? Agreed.
Mhm. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Okay. That's good. That's why always have to be. You always have to have a critical eye on things like this. No, because as I've said, this is how fake news is spread. If we don't take a critical look at this, like information, of course, this is just an example, right? But if similar things proliferate in not only in social media, sometimes even in mainstream media. Okay, so we have to be critical. We have to think. We have to analyze this. Like for example, so early good you point out who is this NGO and 85% of what, and in fact you can ask what are the questions asked, right? It's a practice like for example in our society in every now and then there will be some poll surveys about the trust ratings of certain government officials. What is being asked? What are the questions being asked? And who are these being asked? After a calamity, for example, they survey and then very high trust rating when you have plenty of complaints. So you have to ask certain questions, right? So there are many questions, all right? So the point of this discussion and of this example is this, that you have to be critical about information that we get from or read in the media, whether it's a social or the mainstream media or any other source. Okay? And we have discussed the different criteria, by which we can assess information or arguments like this. What are some possible sources of evidence? So when you do a research, where can you get your evidence or your proof, your information? One, of course, you can get that from books and periodicals. You can get it from newspapers and magazines. Now, when you do academic research, like for example, you're going to write a term paper or thesis or dissertation, mainly rely on books and the periodicals, meaning the journals. You can also use newspapers and magazines, but you have to be uh, careful when using the newspapers and magazines because they are not as as academic as the books and the journals. So of course, the journals will be your source of the most recent scholarship in your field of study. Okay, so since you are in the grad school, you must develop the habit of reading journals and books, not just the magazines or newspapers. Of course, you can use general works, references works, etc., etc. But we have to be careful also with the kind of general reference works that we use. Some people, in the internet, you have the Wikipedia, all right? Nothing wrong with using the Wikipedia. But if you're going to write an academic paper, you have to be more selective of the sources that you use. Okay? Some they will look for Google for some materials, and they will be led to this particular website. Some of them are blogs. Should you quote a blog when you write a term paper or a thesis? That will make your paper less academic because blogs are normally opinions. And some students or some researchers will quote a particular article, for example, without looking at the source or who uploaded this, who wrote it. You may be quoting a term paper of a high school student. So you have to be very careful when you cite internet sources, right? So you get references, you have the encyclopedia, dictionaries, and so on and so forth. Well, another possible source of information will be government or public documents. Okay, so that's very good because these are government and public documents. Go to the library, go to the museum, for example, uh, and you can find lots of good documents there. So if you are in, for example, say researching on, if you are in anthropology, or if you are, for example, in medicine or in some allied sciences, then you go to these public government documents. Okay? You can also make, or you can also get some sources from papers read in professional fora or conferences. But normally nowadays, those papers in conferences, they are not the final papers yet. Okay? So the thing is, you have to wait for these papers presented in conferences to be published in a journal or in the proceeding of the conference. So, well, that will give you initial information, but difficult to quote them because these papers read in conferences are not the final papers. They are not the final papers. They still have to revise that, right? Revise that. Some papers, they still undergo the blind review process before they get published to journals. So it's better to look for the journal articles instead of just quoting papers read in conferences. Well, you can use that as a source of information or evidence, but in academic writing, you would rather use the journals. Okay. Then, of course, you have the internet sources or materials. So nowadays, especially now that we are in quarantine, you have plenty of time to look for internet sources or materials. Again, just a word of caution: do not just quote anything that you get from the internet. You always have to check the source of the internet material. Because as I've said, you may be using an article written by somebody who may not be an expert or who may have just copied something from somebody. It's very easy to find information in the internet now, but you have to be careful about the quality of the information that you get in the source of the information that you get. Any question?
Question, sir.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Regarding po sa recency or updated
Yeah.
materials, so how many years usually do we consider a certain publication?
How
Um,
will how will
how,
you
how many years po of years of
oh
publication? 5 years, 3 years from 2020, so that we could consider it as recent.
it depends on your discipline. It actually depends on your discipline because, like for example, in my case, in philosophy, we still quote sources published, say, 50 years ago because the turnover of information or knowledge in philosophy is not that fast. Philosophers who wrote or published a book in, say, 200, year 2000 will still be relevant to us now.